Hello and welcome back to The Creative Catholics, a podcast on creativity, faith, and the hidden life. I'm your host, Alex Cahill. Before we begin, I want to say a huge thank you to Marie Miller for letting us use her music for the intro and outro, and to Riverside that is sponsoring this episode. We used Riverside to record this episode, and if you're interested in recording audio files for any sort of reason, please check them out at the link in the description and in the show notes. As always, wherever you are today, whatever you're doing while you're listening, whether you're knitting or gardening or painting, maybe you're working on some creative project of your own that I haven't listed before, I'm so glad you're here and let's work on it together. So I've been thinking a lot recently about competition and its relationship with creativity and faith in our hidden lives. And I think competition is one of those things that most of us rarely stop to examine because it feels so normal, especially if, like me, you grew up in environments where competition was simply part of the environment that you lived in. I come from a theater background, and in theater, it is very competitive. You audition for a role, 20 people audition for the role, one person gets it, and that's just how it is. That's how it is with every single facet of theater. But honestly, I don't think it was just theater. I think it was the culture that I grew up in. I grew up as a Midwest millennial in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the message wasn't necessarily find what you love, but the message to our generation was more find out what you're good at and become the best at it. You have to be exceptional. You have to stand out. You have to get into the right schools, get the right opportunities, build the right career. And I think that was just something that was quite ingrained in our culture while we were growing up. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with excellence. There's nothing wrong with working hard. There's nothing wrong with wanting to do something well. But looking back, I think I spent a lot of my younger years viewing life through the lens of competition. If one door opened, I was succeeding. If another person got the opportunity, perhaps I was missing out. If something didn't work out, maybe I had somehow fallen behind or failed at that certain job or task. And then recently, I found myself thinking about one particular rejection, a rejection that completely devastated me at the time. And yet, looking back now, I can see it was one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given to me. So when I was 17, I was absolutely convinced I knew exactly what my future was supposed to look like, which is a remarkable amount of confidence for someone who had barely figured out how to do her own laundry at this point. But I had a plan, a very, very clear plan. I wanted to go to Northwestern University and major in pre-law so I could go on and be an intellectual property lawyer. Now, the funny thing is, and this is something I can only appreciate looking back now, I don't think I actually ever wanted to be a lawyer. I think other people wanted me to be a lawyer. I was argumentative. I loved debating. I would defend my position until the bitter, bitter end. And so people would constantly tell me, you make a great lawyer. You should go into law. That's what you're meant to do. And after hearing enough times, I think I started believing it. The only problem was that every time I actually looked at what lawyers did, it sounded awful to me. I remember one time in junior year of high school, I was actually trying to psych myself up for intellectual property, telling myself it would be so great to sit in a room all day and try to figure out if a patent already existed. And there are definitely people who do enjoy that 100%, and they are needed in this world. And I'm so happy that those people exist, but I am not one of them. I remember reading 1L by Scott Turow, also in high school, and the book follows students through their first year of Harvard Law School. And honestly, the entire time I was reading it, I kept thinking, this sounds terrible. Every chapter made me less and less interested in becoming a lawyer. And yet somehow I kept moving forward on that path anyway. Because, once you've built a picture of your future, it can be surprisingly difficult to let it go. So come senior year, I applied early to Northwestern. I had my heart set on it. And then November arrived and I found out I hadn't been accepted. And I was devastated. It was not mild disappointment. I wasn't slightly upset. I was devastated because at 17 years old, it felt like my entire future had just disappeared. The door I had wanted had closed and I couldn't understand why. But I had applied to 2 other universities as backups. One was on the East Coast and one was my hometown university. So after the Northwestern rejection, I went to visit the East Coast school. And I remember I was walking around campus trying very hard to convince myself that this could be the new plan, that this was exciting, this could work. And then a rat climbed a tree right in front of me. And I remember thinking, nope, not this one. Absolutely not this. This is not where I'm spending the next 4 years of my life. And so honestly, that was pretty much the end of that one. So at the beginning of May, all right, I was graduating end of May from high school. The first week of May, which was very, very late in the process, I accepted a place at my hometown university. And this wasn't because it was my dream school. It wasn't because I was excited about it. It was because it was the only option that remained, basically. And I didn't realize that there were other options that you could do after high school. And we will have a whole other episode, I think, on creative things maybe to do with your life after high school that don't involve university. Because as a retired academic, I can now clearly see that university is not for everyone. But we'll get into that in a different episode. So if I'm honest, when I decided to accept my hometown university's offer, it did feel a bit like I was settling. But here's the thing. At the time, I thought the story was about Northwestern. I thought the story was about not getting what I wanted. But looking back, I can see that God was already writing a completely different story. Or even, you know what? It wasn't like he had taken the pen and, in red ink, decided to write a different story for me. This was always the story he had planned for my life, which I think is amazing looking back. I just couldn't see it yet. So in my hometown university, I enrolled as a cinema and comparative literature major, which was nowhere in my carefully crafted life plan as a 17, 18-year-old. But because I accepted so late, I also applied for housing late, which meant I didn't exactly have my pick of residence halls. So I ended up assigned to the math and science learning community floor. Now, if you ever listened to this podcast or known me for any length of time, you'll know that mathematics and science are not 100% where my gifts lie. So even at the time, I remember thinking, what am I doing here? Who thought this was a good idea? But then something really interesting happened. On the first weekend, I was in my dorms. It was the weekend before school started. I met a woman who would become my absolute best friend. She was studying accountancy, and we became friends almost instantaneously. Then on the Sunday of that first weekend, we both realized that we were Catholic and we went to Mass together at the university chaplaincy. And that friendship became one of the most defining relationships of my university years. We are still best friends to this day. She is the godmother of my children. I am the godmother of hers. And we are very, very close. So during my first semester, I decided to add a theater major. And then I also added a religious studies minor that focused on Judeo-Christian traditions. And somewhere along the way, something else unexpected happened, which was I fell completely in love with theater. And not just watching theater, I realized that I loved making theater, directing theater, creating theater, building something out of nothing and taking an idea and slowly bringing it into reality. And honestly, I was pretty good at it. So I kept saying yes to opportunities, and then more opportunities came and I said yes to those. So that in my final year of university, I directed 9 productions in 7 months, which might sound a bit impressive, but it was utterly exhausting. The truth is, I had been operating at that pace for years, not just in my final year. So through much of university, I was always doing more, always producing more, always striving. And again, it comes back to that competition kind of basis of what are they doing? What am I not doing? Comparing myself constantly. I was always chasing the next thing, the next project, the next opportunity. And by the time I reached my final year, something inside me was starting to push back. I remember realizing at the beginning of my senior year that I really didn't particularly like the person I was starting to become. Not because theater was bad or because hard work was bad. I mean, theater in itself, hard work in itself, both are really good things. But because I had spent years moving at a pace that simply wasn't sustainable. I was not an enjoyable person to be around. And because also in this competitive environment, both in the university, in the department that I was in the career I was in, it naturally fosters a competitive edge. So you constantly are looking over your shoulder and you're constantly comparing yourself even to your best friends that are in the department with you. Thankfully, I mean, it was such a blessing, like I said before, that my best friend in uni was actually an accounting major because there was no comparison there whatsoever. But in that year, I think I'd become addicted to momentum, to activity and achievement. And I always had something else to accomplish. And eventually that does catch up with you. So by kind of October of my final year, I knew one thing very clearly, and that was that I needed a massive change, not a small adjustment or a different project or a holiday or, I needed a complete change and I needed to almost start over. And interestingly, Scotland had never been on my radar. It wasn't something I had dreamed about as a child. It wasn't some long-held goal. It wasn't even particularly a country I had thought about visiting. But suddenly I realized I need to change completely. And part of that requires going somewhere where no one else knows me. And it's actually a really freeing thing to do. And again, we can talk about this more in another episode. But to move to a different country where people don't know you and you have the right and the ability to completely change yourself and no one ties you back to this is who the person you were before, it's extremely freeing. It's extremely freeing. So the possibility appeared that I could be moving to Scotland. I applied to a master's program and I didn't tell anybody that I was doing this. I did this completely on my own, very quietly. No one, my parents, my siblings, my friends, no one knew that I was applying to this master's program because I didn't want anybody to take away that excitement that I had about this whole possibility of kind of rewriting where I was in life. And I found out in January that I got accepted into the program. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. Saying yes to moving to Scotland gave me extreme peace, which I have learned over the years is often how God works in my life. The loudest option isn't always the right one. Sometimes the right path feels a lot quieter, but a lot more steady. And it's a lot more grounded and you just feel this internal peace. So I finished up my senior year and that summer I packed up my life and I moved 4,000 miles away to Glasgow, Scotland. And one of the things that struck me almost immediately was how much less competitive life felt instantaneously. Now, maybe that's because I had come from theater, and maybe it was because I was in a different country. But for the first time in a very, very long time, I didn't feel like I was constantly measuring myself against everyone around me. And in fact, I was the only person doing my master's program, which was a very strange experience. There was literally nobody to compete with because nobody was doing my exact master's program. Nobody was there that I could compare myself to. Nobody doing the exact same thing. It was just me and the work. And my two housemates in Scotland were PhD students in cancer research. They were brilliant people, but even between them, they were studying completely different strands of cancer. So there wasn't this sense of trying to outdo one another. We were all simply each working and doing our own work and walking our own paths. And then there was my faith, which was especially fascinating to me, and the growth that I felt there. Because for much of my life, up until I moved to Scotland, faith had often existed within communities where people were broadly similar. You naturally notice what everyone else is doing, how often they pray, what ministries they're involved in, how much they know, all of those things. But suddenly, I found myself in a friendship group where I was the only Catholic. And you know what was funny is that nobody cared, not in a negative way. They simply accepted it as part of who I was. They're like, Alice goes to Mass on Sundays. We'll see her afterwards. End of discussion. And there was something incredibly freeing about that. Faith stopped feeling like something to compare. It simply became part of my life. It was part of who I was. And the nun at the university chaplaincy actually became one of my closest friends during that time. I would spend hours talking with her, asking questions, thinking about faith, thinking about life, trying to understand what God was doing. But looking back now, I think Scotland gave me space. It gave me space to breathe, space to think, and space to become the person that God wanted me to be. And because I had gone to my hometown university and I was able to take summer classes, I was able to graduate in 3 years instead of 4. But that also meant that I was able to start my master's in Scotland in the autumn of 2010, which then also meant that I was in Scotland at the start of summer in 2011, which is the time that I met my husband. So many of the important things in my life happened because one door closed when I was 17. Had I gone to Northwestern, I wouldn't have studied theater. I wouldn't have graduated in 3 years, which means I probably wouldn't have gone to Scotland because I would have gone to law school. And it also means my life would have been very, very different to what it is today. And this is where I think competition gets really, really interesting because competition is real. Northwestern only had so many places and not everyone could get in. That's reality. The theater world is competitive. Jobs are competitive. Scholarships are competitive. And this is across the board, right? It's not just theater, but this is what I know. Promotions are competitive. Opportunities are competitive. We don't need to pretend that competition doesn't exist. But here's what I've been realizing lately. What if competition isn't the whole story? What if there's something bigger happening? Because if you had asked 17-year-old Alex what the biggest competition in her life was, she would have said Northwestern. That was the prize. That was the opportunity. And that was the thing that she thought she needed. Except it wasn't, at least not for me, because what I couldn't see at 17 was that Northwestern wasn't actually the destination. It was just one possible path to get me somewhere else. But the path God had for me happened to be somewhere else entirely. The fascinating thing is that when I look back now, I don't feel like I lost. I don't feel like someone else won and I lost. I don't feel like life would have been better if I had beaten the competition to get in. I feel actually extremely grateful, deeply, deeply grateful, because God was leading me somewhere I couldn't yet see or imagine. And that's what makes me wonder whether we sometimes think about life as a competition when God is thinking about it as a calling. Because if God had created me to be a lawyer and Northwestern was essential to that path, then more than likely that door would have opened. But it didn't. Instead, another door opened and another and another. And eventually those doors led me to Scotland, which led me to my husband, which led me to my children and this life. And I am so thankful and feel so blessed for that. And when I made this link and this realization, suddenly the question wasn't, how do I be everyone else? The question became, what is God actually asking me to do? And when that question changed, something else changed too. Because if God is asking me to do one thing and he's asking someone else to do another thing, are we actually ever competing? Think about it. Marie Miller, who has so kindly offered her music for our podcast, isn't my competition. Adele Collins, who I talked with the other week, is not my competition. They're not running my race, and I'm not running theirs. We're simply responding to different invitations, different callings, different missions. And that's when I had this realization. When I realized it was about mission, I realized there actually is no competition. Not because competition doesn't exist, not because opportunities aren't limited, but because God's plan for my life isn't threatened by someone else's success, and theirs isn't threatened by mine. And when I had this realization, I started noticing this theme in scripture as well. But the place I saw it most clearly was with John the Baptist. So in John chapter 3, John the Baptist and Jesus are both baptizing in the same river. Verses 23 to 30 say, John also was baptizing at Anan near Salim because there was much water there. And people came and were baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. Now a discussion arose between John's disciples and a Jew over purifying. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, here he is baptizing, and all are going to him. John answered, no one can receive anything except what is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now full. He must increase, but I must decrease. And before we even get to John's response, I have to tell you something I noticed while reading this passage. The gospel tells us there was much water there. And perhaps I'm reading a little bit too much into this, but I love that phrase because there was enough. Enough water for John, enough water for Jesus, enough water for anyone who wanted to be baptized. Isn't that interesting? Because then immediately after we're told there's plenty of water, the disciples begin worrying about scarcity. They come to John essentially saying, everyone's going to him now. I think it's so interesting because the Bible clearly tells us there is enough water for everyone. And yet they're worried about who is getting more people in the water. And honestly, I think we do the same thing. God's kingdom operates from a place of abundance, but we often operate from a mindset of scarcity. We look at someone else's success and think, well, if they're succeeding, maybe there's less room for me. If their business is growing, perhaps mine can't. If their ministry is flourishing, maybe mine won't. But God's kingdom isn't a pie that gets divided into smaller and smaller pieces if more people come to the table. It's a lot like the river. There's a lot of water there. There's enough grace, enough opportunities, enough purpose, and there's enough room for each of us to become who God created us to be. And John seems to understand this instinctively because when his disciples start worrying about competition, he never takes the bait. He simply says, he must increase and I must decrease. John understands that Jesus gaining followers doesn't diminish John's mission because his mission was never threatened by Jesus' success in the first place. His mission was actually fulfilled in Jesus' ministry. I think his response is extraordinary because there is no competition in that statement. He's not saying that it's a bad thing that he has to decrease. There's no jealousy, no comparison, no anxiety. There's just clarity. John knew what his mission was. His job was never to be Jesus. His job was to point people to Jesus. And because he understood his mission, he never felt threatened by someone else's success. And then we have this other passage from St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that I think is another very clear moment where we're taught that competition just does not exist when it comes to missions. Chapter 12 says, "Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of working, but it is the same God who inspires them all in every one. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are inspired by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills." Now, that is usually the part that we don't necessarily hear, because the part that we hear is the part that follows where it talks about the one body, how there's many members in the one body, but they are all of the one body, so it is with Christ. We nearly always start with, "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ." That's verse 12. We usually start with verse 12 when we read it. But I find that section beforehand so important. It's talking about all of the different types of gifts and talents and missions that people can have, and that they are not the same. I love the fact that it then goes on to talk about how if the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the organs in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single organ, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. Okay? I've always found this amusing because when you really think about it, the whole idea of competition falls completely apart in this passage. So imagine that your eye becomes jealous of your hand, or your foot tries to outperform the ear, right? It's ridiculous. And yet we do this all the time. We compare our gifts to someone else's gifts, our calling to someone else's calling. We even compare the season we're in to someone else's season that has nothing to do with us. But Paul doesn't describe the church as a competition. He describes it as a body, and bodies aren't designed for competition. They're designed for cooperation. They're designed so that each part contributes something unique, something necessary, something that no other part can provide. And perhaps that's why comparison feels so exhausting, because we're trying to function in a way that we weren't created to function. We're trying to become someone else when God is inviting us to become ourselves. And perhaps that's why one of my favorite places to think is in a garden, because gardens understand something that humans, I think, often forget. I've never walked through a garden and seen a rose trying to be a sunflower. I've never seen lavender apologizing because it's a peony, or heard a dahlia say, "I wish it could be a hydrangea." Each flower simply becomes what it was created to become. And because it does, the garden is absolutely beautiful when it's blooming. It's not despite the differences, it's because of them. And sometimes I wonder whether God looks at us the same way, because we spend so much of our lives looking sideways, comparing, measuring, evaluating, wondering if we're enough, if we're successful enough or talented enough. But meanwhile, God may simply be asking us, are you becoming who I created you to be? Because I don't think the goal was ever to actually become the best, quote unquote. I think the goal is to become yourself, fully, faithfully, and joyfully. We're not random collections of talents and interests and opportunities. We are intentionally created. We are known, loved, and formed by God. And perhaps the greatest act of gratitude we can ever offer God is to become the person He made us to be. Not a copy of someone else, not a second-rate version of another creator, not the person social media tells us to be, but the person God designed us to be. Looking back now, I can see that 17-year-old Alex thought Northwestern was the goal. She thought that acceptance letter was the thing standing between her and the life she wanted, but she couldn't see Scotland. She couldn't see theater. She couldn't see the husband she would meet halfway across the world. All she could see at that moment was a closed door. And because of that, she mistook redirection for rejection. But 20 years later, I can see that God wasn't rejecting me. He was guiding me one step at a time, one unexpected turn at a time. And maybe there's a door in your life that you're still grieving, or a life that unfolded differently than you imagined. Maybe you're still standing in front of that closed door and wondering, why, God, why did you do this? And of course, I can't promise that one day every question will be answered because some things remain mysteries this side of heaven. But I can say, looking back over my own life, especially at that moment when I was 17, I've found that God's providence is almost always easier to see in reverse. The threads of our lives only become visible when you step back far enough to see the tapestry. And somewhere along the line, if we're paying attention, we begin to realize that God has been leading us all along, not into someone else's life, not into someone else's mission, but into our own. When I realized it was about mission, I realized there was no competition. Not because opportunities aren't limited, not because doors don't close, not because life is always fair, but because God isn't asking me to live your life. He's asking me to live mine. I came across a quote recently that said, the longer you stay on the wrong train, the more expensive it is to get home. Now, as somebody who lives in the UK and takes trains quite regularly, that is 100% true. But how it relates to our spiritual life is massive, because I wonder how much of our exhaustion comes from trying to live lives that were never meant to be ours. Trying to meet expectations God never placed on us, trying to win competitions He never asked us to enter. Looking back now, I can see that what felt like rejection is often redirection. None of them were the end of the story. God was leading me toward a life that I just couldn't see yet, but a life that was mine. And maybe that's the invitation for all of us, to trust that God knows where He's leading us. He is the author of our stories. We need to stop measuring our lives against someone else's. We need to stop looking sideways. We need to stop running races we were never called to run. Because the moment you discover your mission, competition loses its power. Not because other people stop succeeding, but because you finally understand that their calling was never yours, and yours was never theirs. And when competition disappears, I think something remarkable happens. You become freer to enjoy the life God has given you, freer to be grateful for your own gifts, freer to pursue your mission with joy instead of anxiety, and perhaps most surprisingly, freer to celebrate the people around you. Because someone else's success is no longer a threat. It's simply another example of God at work. The garden becomes more beautiful every time another flower blooms. And so do our lives. There's no competition in God's calling. Only the joy of becoming who He created you to be and then cheering others on as they become who God created them to be. Until next time, stay creative and keep making what matters most.